We live in a world in which the content of democracy has vanished and society is dominated by a strange, meaningless notion of freedom. This is a story about how we arrived at this upside-down world.
Francis Fukuyama, author of the book The End of History and the Last Man. What's it all about?
The book is about the question of whether there exists such a thing as what I would call history with a capital H. We usually associate history with just the routine flow of events, the war in the Persian Gulf, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But my book tries to ask a larger question, whether there is such a thing as a history of human society, taking into account the experiences of all peoples in virtually all times, and whether there is a kind of coherent evolution in the nature of those societies as they progress from, very primitive agricultural, tribal societies up through various monarchies and aristocracies, up to the kind of liberal democracy and technologically driven capitalism that we have today. And the end of history refers to what I think still remains a question of whether that process is one that can terminate, whether that evolution, finally culminates in a certain kind of civilization that in a certain sense will be the last civilization that mankind will achieve, because in a certain sense it's the right one, it's the one that fits human nature in an appropriate way. And what I argue in the book is that liberal democracy comes much closer to fitting human nature in that sense than virtually any type of prior, form of government or political organization or social organization.
The third component essential to understanding how we arrived at this situation was the destruction of the socialist-inspired left of the traditional political spectrum. This was achieved through the destruction of organised labour, the working class and the international socialist movement. This destruction robbed the political left of its funding, its constituency and its intellectual foundation. This destruction of the political left would be heralded as the end of history.
Some socialists seem to believe that people should be numbers in a state computer. We believe they should be individuals. We're all unequal. No one, thank heavens, is quite like anyone else, however much the socialists may pretend otherwise. And we believe that everyone has the right to be unequal, but to us, every human being is equally important.
But T Street has a special claim to fame. No adult over 20 has a regular job, apart from Danny Doyle, who's 35 and blind. He works in the Unemployment Benefits Office, an ironic twist of fate.
Yeah, I suppose there is with so many people in this particular area being unemployed and me having a job. Really, you might say if they had a job, there'd be no need for me to have one.
Throughout the 1970s and 80s, governments across the West waged war against organised labour and the working class. The Reagan and Thatcher governments vilified the union movement, intelligence services infiltrated them and discredited their leaders, and the media, now under financial industry control, dutifully pushed the narrative. The financial sector convinced governments that the only way to lower inflation was to raise interest rates to reduce the supply of money. In reality, this led to deep recessions that created mass unemployment while protecting corporate profits and allowed monopolies to further consolidate control over the economy.
The brothers were helped in their market stall business by a grant of £40 a week.
Now, I happened to arrive in the Treasury in 1970. When I got there, people really felt that they didn't quite understand how the economy worked anymore. And one particular example of this was that we saw unemployment and inflation rising at the same time. And that was something that should have been quite impossible. To start with, I must admit, I didn't believe the monetarists for a moment. This seemed totally implausible. This was the sort of economics that I'd been told to discard for all the time I'd been learning economics. It was a joke, really. It wasn't to be taken seriously. Whatever else one used to explain inflation, it wasn't the money supply. The nightmare I sometimes have about this whole experience runs as follows. I was involved in making a number of proposals which were partly at least adopted by the government and put in play by the government. Now, my worry is as follows, that there may have been people making the actual policy decisions, or people behind them, who never believed for a moment that this was the correct way to bring down inflation. They did, however, see that it would be a very, very good way to raise unemployment. And raising unemployment was an extremely desirable way of reducing the strength of the working classes, if you like. That what was engineered there, in Marxist terms, was a crisis of capitalism which recreated the reserve army of labour and has allowed the capitalists to make high profits ever since. Now, again, I don't say I believe that story, but when I really worry about all this, I worry whether, indeed, that was really what was going on.
And if we look at the next set, Viner's executive suite, again, read the small print, Hong Kong or Korea. And the only contact that these knives, forks and spoons have had with Sheffield is that that's where they were put in the box.
At the same time, outsourcing of manufacturing to low-cost economies and the collapse of domestic industry broke the back of the working class. Full-time, high-wage, high-skill jobs in the industrial sector were replaced by low-wage, low-skill, zero-hour contracts in the service sector, and workers were forced into a self-destructive race to the bottom. As real income stagnated and then declined, the working class fragmented and divided. As education and employment opportunities declined, an increasingly disempowered and disenfranchised urban peasantry emerged.
No doubt it might have been possible to avoid many mistakes, to have done much in a better way, but I am sure that sooner or later our common joint efforts will yield their fruit. Our peoples will live in a prosperous and democratic society. I wish all of you the very best.
Finally, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the international socialist movement robbed the political left of their intellectual foundation. All these factors combined to create a political vacuum that the financial elite was quick to fill with a newly created political class.
Even our relationship with business and industry, there is a third way, a new way, between some command economy, state control of industry, and the politics of laissez-faire. This third way seeks a partnership between government and business, but this time limited to certain key specific objectives, whose aim is not to undermine the market, but to enhance the dynamism of the market. Not that we rerun back to the policies of 20 years ago.
To fill the void left behind by the destruction of the socialist movement, this new class of technocrats and political apparatchiks searched for a safe, corporate-friendly, apolitical vision of liberation to replace it. As they did so, they embraced a strange, meaningless notion of freedom dreamt up by an obscure group of intellectuals in the 1950s. The next chapter will explore where this idea came from.
The kind of politics we have now, where the left is represented by this kind of Obama-Macron-style centrism, where you're both for the market and for bureaucracy at the same time, is kind of horrible, right? The only possible appeal of that kind of politics is, well, at least they're not Nazis, right? So what they want is the left to be this kind of mishmash of bureaucratic market centrism, and the right to be outright fascist. To set the ball rolling in an actual left direction will make that centrism look like utterly unappealing. In France, sometimes they talk about the extreme center, and I think that's a fitting phrase. What the center has been reduced to. It's become this pure set of performative symbols. And at the same time, you get to feel morally superior, which is ultimately what centrism, what liberal centrism is all about, is the ability to feel better than other people.